Record. Recording. Okay, that seems to be working.
Yeah, it's starting working.
Okay. Um, I just asked Gavin briefly if he has um, some ideas, and he has a few, maybe possible, but not a lot to say. So we can structure this as we choose, but I do not want to lecture a long time as I did on Monday, which is um, uh, not necessary now. Let me get this more on me. And we have two items which are of broader interest, which we'll use in part today from Dan Silver and from Tong Wong and me for the Scenes Academy um, plannings. But the beginning is first of all simply to ask any students who have any questions. And we can start with you, Gavin, and or I can just mention one or two very simple things, but um, we can then, if we don't have much of an organized presentation, you can think if there's something, if you want to show just a little bit of your work, like graphics or things that are easily available, you could do that. If not, if you have a few questions that you want to raise, for instance, with your team of four as well, if you have questions about this course that would be good to discuss here on the video now, that would be fine too. So I'll leave that as a question for you, um, Johan, briefly. But um, the Gavin, do you have any basic questions at all about Mercer? Just I mean quick reactions, any reactions generally to the course or that things that are clear, simple, hard, a little anything that you saw at all or reading that seemed vague or not fully convincing or clear. Just mention that, please. How's that sound?
I mean, I guess I definitely found the whole like Benjamin discussion of like flaneur. Am I saying that right? Flaneur.
Yep,
Um, but I found that whole concept interesting, but still like a little confused at what it exactly means. So I guess just some clarification on flaneur and its applications and kind of like just revisiting Benjamin's discussion of that.
absolutely. Okay, that's a very good suggestion, specific, and a very important one. Intellectually in, for 20th century discussions of the introduction of consumption and where and why. And it percolated in a couple of different ways. So let me frame that a little more broadly. Um, and I'll make one quick first point, which was this is what I talked about the whole session on Monday. That is not Benjamin, but what I did focus on much, much more was where and why did the arts and culture, as part of consumption within the broader economic category or industrial category of types of activity, where and why did consumption take off? And there were different versions of that one or two I mentioned briefly, but mostly I use the examples from economics in part because the whole discipline of economics has changed in conjunction with this. And this department here is exciting to be nearby and to see these changes. So fundamentally, and then to have Gary Becker and his students and colleagues as transforming the rest of the discipline, building in turn on the generation before, generation and a half, whatever, of Paul Samuelson starting the mathematization of economics in the 1940s, which was such a revolution over the Keynes 1920s and 30s of economics more generally as being literary, or let's say textual, rather than filled with equations and tables of data. There were no measures of GNP, as I've said a couple of times, in the 20s or 30s. This came from Simon Kuznets. He did a city version of this in his Belarusian town where he worked on his PhD initially. And then when he came to the US, he got national data for the first really gross national product measurement. And there we are. The when I say there we are, I want to by that refer to the general transformation away from simple production, and GNP includes both production and consumption, buying television sets, buying restaurant meals, anything that gets recorded with a market in dollars or French francs or whatever was part of the national GNP when those were generated. And I'll mention just in passing that when we get to versions of this now, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of little equations that come from all kinds of journal articles, studies of this or that. For instance, how does the what are the components that come together of an automobile? And you have tires, wheels, steering wheels, glass. Where and how do these things fit together, and how much do they, what's the impact of each of those on adding a contribution to either a car or a Cadillac or a Chevrolet or a particular model of a Chevrolet, etc. So these kinds of econometric studies of all kinds of sorts are judgmentally, there's a big judgmental aspect of bringing those together into a nationally integrated set of numbers and or equations in terms of how much of the data get transferred from one data set to another data set. And I'll make the simple point in passing as well, that there are many different data sources, different assumptions, different units, time periods, which are the social, intellectual, economic background, which generate those criteria, those equations for what's included and or how and what's the definition of the components that come together to become GNP. And I use that example because it's so widely discussed and taken as fact, simple and clear, but in fact it's like most things else. There's a lot of measurement error, and Kuznets himself, when he first created it, said this should, if nothing else, this should not be a measure of happiness, goodness, success, vitality, whatever. This is only a very rough measure of money in a narrow materialistic sense, whereas life, or the economic term preferences or responding to preferences, is a very different kind of concern. Okay, roughly at the same time that 1930s innovation of Kuznets, if we wanted to, so Kuznets, and it's a good example because he did this under Stalin. This is the toughest part of the Soviet Union in the sense of government control, and yet we have this highly innovative PhD that he came up with in terms of his own I don't know how much was his advisors or whatever. I don't know the details. I when I was teaching at Harvard, I was right next door to him, and I had some great conversations. Um, uh, okay, I'll avoid anecdotes. His son is also an economist at Indiana University, and we had a great conversation for dinner, and the father clearly led the conversation. I'll just leave it at that, if you will. But it was great. The uh, I'll mention as well at that point I was for a while in the it was a house belonged to Harvard, and which in turn Daniel Bell was living in. And I'll mention I'd early been a student of Bell at Columbia for my PhD work, but Dan will talk about, if we get to a little bit of Dan's today. Dan features Daniel Bell as a major theorist of these transformations away from traditional economics and production into a not only a even though he himself, I'll add quickly, as with Lipset, as with many others, Daniel Bell was part of the CCNY, the City Colleges of New York, Marxist group that was part of what they called the second alcove. I think it was alcove 2, which was not the Stalinists, but the second group of Marxists, which were Trotskyites, other kinds of Marxists, but who were fighting with the Stalinists. And so where and how to do this was the kind of thing which they then continued, they being a group of them which are featured in the film. Uh, um, which sorry, I'll come back with the name in a minute, but I mentioned it in class earlier. It's against the world, or arguing the world, or arguing the world, I think that's the approximate title of it. It's a terrific, it's a website, it's a book, it's a documentary, it's a fantastic intellectual documentary that is used here at this university in many places on Marxism in America and some of the leading Marxists in America, and where and how they changed in that period from the 1930s onward. Um, and it focuses on four people, one of which is Daniel Bell, Nathan Glazer, and Irving Kristol, uh, and the four of them. Okay, all New York Jewish, middle class. They all went to CCNY, but they were very creative. Um, and so they were, and so I'm pointing to these examples. Kuznets for economics, Daniel Bell and company at CCNY in the 1930s, same decade, and then we're adding Benjamin, so the leading intellectual of Weimar Germany, as a literary man. His training was in literature, but he wanted to understand why the Marxist interpretation, I won't say anything, failed, maybe not failed, let's say demanded reinterpretation in terms of inclusion of Paris. Why does Paris not fit with the Marxist classic interpretation? They didn't build any factories. They didn't have any industry. How can you go from agriculture and the court to the 21st century, and having today a cost of living, the prices, the tourism, the economic activity. I won't mention the political activities, as today the government has lost a vote of support from so the political system is a mess right now, but if you will, but the economy of France through the 19th and 20th century was remarkably successful, much in terms of simple measure of the GNP, or the cost of eating in a restaurant or a cafe, or cost of living for renting land or whatever in Paris, is much higher than Chicago or New York, and it's more similar to London, if you will, and Tokyo. Uh, so in this respect, how could they do this and not have any industry? Okay, that's why Benjamin spent the second half of his life in Paris trying to understand. And the one word question you asked was in a one word answer was the flaneur, FLANEUR, which you can translate as a shopper, a person looking around, observing, and I'm adding just a little more because it was not simply material acquisition. The concept and the term came from Balzac, the novelist in the early 19th century, and Baudelaire, the poet at the end of the French 19th century. They both used that term to describe what they did, and they did in their essays and in their novels and in their poetry, which was they gave you a perspective on life. That's what they felt they wanted to do. But they did, especially when we get to so Balzac said, we want to create freedom for the artists to be creative. And this is Jane Jacobs. This is Schumpeter and so forth, 100 years earlier. We want to be creative for the artists, for the intellectuals, for including, they didn't talk a lot about science, qua science, but they talked about new ideas and freedom to do whatever you want. And so Balzac said, to do this, we ought to have one neighborhood in Paris where people could live together as artists, and we could have art galleries, and we could have restaurants, and we could be free in many respects in relationship to each other. That then by the end of the 19th century, that got applied on the term in opera and elsewhere was bohemian. And so the bohemianism of a looser, free lifestyle spread to Greenwich Village in New York. And then, as I said, it's now all around the world. And so what's the critical Marxist linkage is, again, ironic because Benjamin, not having any financial support in Paris, and for most of he knew about Adorno and Horkheimer in Frankfurt, who were both inherited wealth, substantial in Frankfurt, but also were university professors at the University of Frankfurt, where I studied with them later on. But when they went to basically, Benjamin had linkages loosely with them about possibly doing a PhD under them, but did not. And clearly he was that is, they were, even though they said, Adorno and Horkheimer said, we're joining Freud because of advertising as a way of adding something to the simple aspects of traditional, let's say, Leninist Marxism. And so that was their version. I'm adding now a fourth of, different versions of adding consumption. The Frankfurt version was Freud, if you will, in the crude, simple sense, as I'll give you a one sentence version was, you students suffered more under Hitler. Adorno and Horkheimer went to America, but it was worse because the Americans didn't realize that they were being forced to smoke those cigarettes, to drive those Cadillacs, to live that kind of lifestyle. It was forced upon them by the advertising, and it was in their heads. And Hollywood and the American advertising system has destroyed the minds of people. Okay, I mean that was the crude, simplistic sentence or two which I heard physically of Adorno say, and he said it more than once. And he said things like that because the most important is an essay that's been widely used still in courses in the US today and around the world, and it's on Hollywood. It's a critique of Hollywood as written around, it's in the 1940s by Adorno and Horkheimer. And it basically said what I've just said here with 20 pages or so. And that the content was chosen by the film directors. I mean, they names actors, directors, and so forth, producers. And so why is this theoretically important in that example and then in that essay? It links capital, the linkage to capitalism more generally, to the subjective sense and consumption of the mind of smoking cigarettes. And what is that mechanism? Advertising. So advertising combined with those things which are not crudely advertising, but which are Hollywood entertainment, which in the 1920s and 30s, I'll add, in the early 30s, when films were taking off more and more, they began to have talking, then they soon added color and so forth. Those movie houses across America, hundreds, if not thousands of them, were owned by or tightly controlled by the big Hollywood corporations, Warner Brothers being one of the biggest, for instance. By the late 30s, the US government of Roosevelt and others said, this is monopolistic. We don't want to let this continue. And so they forced them to sell off those individual movie houses. But that example at least was a little more more tangible in the interpretation of Adorno. Okay, so I'm answering the bigger question of where does consumption come from. I'm now adding 2 or 3 more sentences on the flaneur, which is the Benjamin version, and which in turn he took quite directly from Balzac, but more specifically Baudelaire. Namely, not just, as Kuznets said, material consumption. In that sense, what he was doing, or what he said without using the term, but which was later on applied by the Chicago economists, and I talked about on Monday, which is amenities. Amenities are a non-market good or service or something you can see even if you don't pay for. And if you are standing outside a window and looking inside the window and you see a necktie, an umbrella, a pair of shoes for your lady friend who is here on your arm with your top hat as painted in the Impressionist paintings, they're not buying it. They are looking at it and they're articulating a participation in a sense. The written work of Balzac and Baudelaire was intended to give you a feel for what was in the minds and in the bodies and in the souls, if you will, of the individual readers and topics of the literary work. And this, of course, I will add that Balzac was the most famous, widely written, the first ever hugely written and read and bought by his books and supported financially by the sale of his books as a novelist in France. At the same time, the same thing happened with Dickens, and Dickens traveled to the US as well as all over the world in the English-speaking world, and that these novelists for the first time were generating lots of money. But at the same time, I'm contrasting they as artists earning some money that way, which could be measured in the GNP. There were many things which were not recorded as material production, and which were, what's happening here? Gavin, you see me okay? I'm sliding up on my screen. I don't know if that makes. Click if you want to switch to a different microphone or speaker. Is there anything different from you? No.
Looks the same.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That's fine. I'll just ignore that. Uh, the so what I want to add is what we're trying to do as well in scenes. That is to capture what's going on when you see the flaneur. And of course, the flaneur in the example of Benjamin, the first version was I'll reach over I think I have my copy right here. It was a series of essays that were not yet published as a book in the 1930s. Harvard University Press brought this out, called The Arcade Project, and there were, I think, 2 other volumes. And this is 1999. Okay, this is just the end of the 20th century. This then became a hugely widely read study. Okay, and the essay, which is on our syllabus, is on Paris. It's an introduction. He did 2 versions, which are both published here. Introduction and synthesis, distillation, very short and distilled, and that's why, Gavin, even if you've read it 2 or 3 times, it's a dense, internally conflictual essay because it has orthodox Marxist analysis, such as saying the boulevards of Paris and Haussmann's destruction of those old beggars' little streets were making it safe for the armies to gallop through and to come through with guns and so forth if there was a potential revolution. Okay, so that's the Marxist interpretation, which many would talk about. Nothing original of Benjamin, he just repeated that. But then what Benjamin added was taking the term flaneur from Baudelaire and Balzac, but then putting it together with where and how this walking of the shopper, the flaneur, which you saw as well in many of the paintings of the Impressionist era, Monet, etc., walking through the streets of Paris, as well as some of the Normandy or suburban Parisian attractive scenes were painted because the railroads were then created into the end of the 19th, and painters started to go out for a weekend or 2 in places where they could paint in the countryside, and Renoir, in that way, one of the very famous paintings of Renoir was of boatsmen not being dirty and sticky and sweaty and from the boat, but they come into the cafe and they're in the restaurant. Actually, it's a restaurant, not a cafe. And they're there surrounded by, and then there's an interesting now interpretation of that specific painting. Shows this was the would to be mayor, I believe, of the city of in Vietnam under the administration of the French colony. That is, there are about 20 people who were identifiable as important in that restaurant, and this was an attractive enough place that you could get to and go to on a train that many leading Parisians were then exploring in that way enough to be painted. Okay, it's a scene. The scene is not one person. It is the combination of the sweaty boaters, the Seine River in the background, the food. I think there's a was it a cat being included as well. A variety of these activities which give you not just one atomistically assumed, uniquely segmented from everything else, and call it a restaurant. This is what I am giving you, a pleasant, teasing critique of the Chicago economics tradition of assuming how we study amenities. And so EdGlaeser, and brilliant that he is, I would say, and I gave you his examples of discussion of the city of New Orleans and the restaurant with this example, suggesting if you leave out all the rest of this other stuff, you're not understanding what a flaneur is doing. Okay, that's my long answer to your question. What I think, well, I'll stop for a second. And Gavin, do you want to follow up with anything on that or a comment?
No, I think that was great. You definitely gave a good answer to that question. It's helpful.
Any other thoughts from any other concept or concern that you want to raise?
I don't have anything right now, but something might come up later. If I do, I'll ask.
Okay. Johan, do you want to are you comfortable presenting a section from Dan Silver that we went over? And I think I think you said yes, but are you comfortable to show that now?
For the
Yeah.
for
What do you call
recording.
it? Share. I mean, I think what you call it, can you use your screen showing it here on via Zoom, or is that not easy for you to do?
Yeah, I can. I think that's easy to share.
Okay.
So this was
Yeah.
so it's
Okay. Well, here we go.
okay.
This is a particularly articulate, excellent discussion, and I haven't really given you much talk from Dan Silver personally, so let's give him a chance.
Data on how to compare scenes. The evolution of scenes theories culminate in what I call the 5 Ds of scenes evolution. And 4 of these Ds have already in the Wuhan Journal. So I would encourage you to look there to understand it better. But in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the last section and talk about how we are now beginning to scenes internationally in a way that includes Chinese scenes. Okay. So scenes research has always been very, very international. From the very beginning, we have worked with international collaborators. In particular, I think and this shows Spanish scenes. This is Canadian scenes. This is scenes in Paris. This is scenes in Poland. And go prepared. Our meetings have always been international. In Chicago, we had people from all around the world. For Toronto, constantly coming and learning from one another. And what we are continuously impressed with is that, well, the scenes theory allows us to understand local differences between the countries. We find a great amount of commonality as well. In almost everywhere we go, the first factor that explains the scenescape in that country is something where we have a contrast between more urbane dimensions, more glamorous, more self-expressive, more rationalistic and modern, compared to the more community types of dimensions. It's very interesting, and we'll see that pattern again when we get to Chinese scenes. But doing that work in the traditional form is very labor intensive. It takes a lot of time. And that's because first you need to find the data. Then you need to gather the data. Then you have thousands of different categories, which you then need to ask these questions about to determine what the content is of the data, which takes a huge amount of time to do that over and over and over again. And then if you've done it once and you get a new data set, you have to do it again for the new data set in your own country. Then you need a new team to do it in the next country, train that team and all of the like. It's very difficult. The other problem is the data itself. Every country now, or traditionally, would have its own data. We use data from the national statistics agencies, which are, we often think, the highest quality, but they have different collection approaches in different countries. They use different geographies. They tend to be focused on industry and not consumption. So it's very hard to compare them. So we have huge challenges in the research methodology, the coding methodology, and also in the data sources.
Just to try.
To big data and our entry, our exit from essentialist thinking and into population thinking, we can actually solve some of these problems in a way that just 10 years ago was impossible. How are we doing that? Well, with the team of computer scientists, we're collecting Google Maps data for most places in the world that we could do it for. So you see a map of where we have individual amenity point data developing. This is an example. If you showed this to me 10 years ago, I would have thought you're crazy, but we can just now have comparable data from the same data set, same categories for Seoul, for London, for Chicago, for Brazil, for Canada. The second problem, though, is how do we take the coding that we do in one place and transfer it over to other places to save the labor? And this is, again, where computer scientists are helping us. They are using modern techniques, they're called semantic matching, where you can take a set of categories and use computer techniques to line them up with a different set of categories and score each one in terms of how similar the meaning is. Then you manually look at them to determine which match best. That does take some manual human intervention. But the result is you could save a huge amount of time and import your coding from one team onto the data of a different team. And so we can move around our conceptualization from one place to another. Done that for 15 cities internationally, tested the methods, and they seem to be quite robust. And the new work is applying those methods to the Chinese data set I was telling you about before. It's a bit complicated because we do not currently have Google data, so we can map it on to the GNP data that we have and use our codes from the other sources in combination with our Chinese team coding to build a more robust measurement. So I recently pursued an experiment. It was an experiment. And the question is, how much impact does the research team have on the vision of the scenescape that we get based on the different coding methods. And I tried it in a few different ways. So I apply it first specifically to Beijing and Shanghai, and I created 2 square kilometer, very small grids. I also apply it to our 354 city data set with administrative districts. And we try on both of those 3 different approaches to computing scenes metrics. First approach, we use only the Western codes. So we use the codes that we use in the book Scenescapes, and we apply those codes to the Chinese case. We match them up. Second, we average. So we have codes created by our Chinese collaborators, and we average the Western and the Chinese. That's method 2. Method 3, we replace the Western codes with the Chinese codes whenever we have them available. And then our question is how similar the results are. Now, let me just show you a bit of what the data looks like so you know. Here's Beijing and Shanghai. This is the grids I mentioned, 2 square kilometer grids. This is the distribution of dance organizations. Western fast food. Yellow is war. Interior design. There's Wuhan. I can make more of these now for Wuhan. I just figured out how to create them. Hairdressing. Pause there.
补充一下，刚才谈到的发射然后昨晚新的方法，我们吸收去。
The overall scene dimension profile in experiments before, now the question is, how did it turn out? And this shows the overall scene dimension profile for, on the left-hand side, the 350 cities by their districts, and on the right-hand side for Shanghai and Beijing for those grid cells. And notice how the lines are almost the same. That's a striking result. It tells us that if we use the Western codes or the Chinese codes or in combination, we get almost the same picture, which is a testament to the power of the scenes methodology, because we ask the questions for coding in a rigorous and reproducible way so that once people understand them, they begin to apply them in the same way. And moreover, since we study combinations of many things and not one single thing, one small difference does not make a big difference to the whole population that we are looking at. There are some small differences which we can discuss. The Chinese team tended to see things a bit more in terms of utilitarian functions and less in terms of charisma than the Western team. But the overall result is the same. And I did the same thing the other direction. I took the Chinese coding and I applied that to the American scenes, right, to see like what a Chinese view of the American scene would look like. And of course, in the same way, we get almost the same result. These are just the correlations of the different methods. And the correlation is almost perfect. We get almost the perfect correlation, except for a few directions. So the main point is scenes theory provides a very powerful basis for cross-national, international comparison that seems to be valid across the research team. Confident in these measures, we can use them. So this shows the location of more self-expressive and artistic scenes in Beijing and Shanghai. Darker is higher. And you see some concentration in the city centers. And then we can use spatial statistics to clarify the view a little bit. Red areas are areas where you have high scene next to another high scene. While green areas where high is next to low. So it's clear Shanghai has greater concentration of artistic and self-expressive scenes compared to Beijing, whereas in Beijing, you have some, but they're more isolated. And likewise with glamour, we can see the concentration, the more fashion and glamour-oriented scenes in Shanghai, in a few pockets, but we have some strong pockets in Beijing as well. The last thing I want to say in just this preliminary description of the Chinese scenescape is here we can compare all cities to one another. And this graph does that. So the kind of blue squiggly lines in the back are the 350 cities and their scene profiles. And then the colored dots are the 5 cities I'm visiting on the strip: Beijing, Chengdu, Chongqing, Shanghai, and Wuhan. And it's interesting, if we look across, we see the brown dot is Chengdu, which has really taken scenes development seriously and integrated it in one form or another into its policy, is quite at the top along the way. We see Wuhan with the pink dot, which is right there and higher than average in almost every single dimension. So this really highlights the work of people trying to develop scene theory in these cities and how effective it has been.
通过地理分布展示了地理广告分布展示了特殊数额场景。
I'll show you today is how we can boil things down a bit, simplify the picture, and see what are the most common scene types according to this data set in China right now. Now to do that, we use a statistics technique called factor analysis. And what that does is look for things that usually go together. Okay, and in this case, we're looking for scenes dimensions that usually go together. And at the top, in the pink, you can see the dimensions that most typically combine. And that's a scene I call cosmopolitan urbanity. It's combining self-expressiveness, exhibitionism, glamorousness, but also neighborliness and the state. It's very similar to the first factor that we find in other countries. So in this respect, the Chinese scenescape is quite similar. The major factor has to do with these dimensions. However, there are some perhaps unique or at least special differences. In this case, we see how those more artistic, expressive dimensions are also combined with neighborliness and tradition to some extent in China in a way in which they're usually opposed in the other countries that we have studied. That's an interesting question for us to discuss why that is. It can be something about how in Chinese culture, these kind of artistic and also traditional aspects are more likely to be combined. It can also be the stage of development, where we have less development of village and rural cultural scenes as a distinct alternative. And if that happens, we would maybe see this separate a bit more because all of these development processes are present at once in China. But in any case, this provides us a target for understanding and tracking those changes as they develop. Some of the other scenes we find here are everyday, like functional scenes that are very utilitarian. We find scenes devoted to local culture to a high degree, local tourist attractions, also strong focus on local educational facilities, as well as those focused on tradition and community.
接下来他通过因此分析，展示了数个场景图在中国城市的整体的聚类特点。结果
Final image I'll show today. What we can do once we have these metrics is compare places according to them. And what you see is that in these graphs, the tier of the city really explains differences in their scenes much more than the regions do, although regions are important. But more important is the city tier. So at the top tier left, we see that pretty much all the scene types are strongest. And as you go down the urban tiers, they all go down almost in lockstep. The one scene that doesn't follow that pattern is the more local scene, which makes sense. It's the more locally oriented types of scenes, which are first and most being developed in the middle tier cities in a lot of the work that people are doing to make them more attractive. But nevertheless, this is also a distinctive pattern. I don't think we see the same pattern in Canada or the United States, the steep difference between the high level of scene development in the top tier cities and then a direct line going down in the other cities. Of course, this shows the challenge and opportunity that Chinese policymakers have to try to develop and advance the post-industrial scenes transition across the entire urban landscape.
刚才简单介绍了另外一个方法是通过地理区域和城市的分级观察场域。
I think this is our presentation from Professor Wang Tong. Do we need to share other more information or
You say from Wu Jun or Tong Wang?
Tong Wang? Yeah.
Tong Wang. Okay. Now there are four of us are co-authors of the book. The two leaders are the two Chinese. This is a new book. It's coming out this week, just becoming available, and it focuses on some of the things which were that is, why did we do this? And I'll say a few words about this now. So thank you. That's we get an overview from Dan. You get his own voice. So you can see, and what you've heard presented here are some very recent new work on the Chinese cities with these original Chinese data. These are changes, new findings since the Scenescapes book is basically what he's giving an overview there. And what many people reading the Scenescapes book are now asking, especially in specifically in China, the issue with the Scenes Academy is what's new. If this is that is a second, there are two terms in this title: the cultural power of scenes, and second, the new Chicago School of Urban Development. And the question is, what's new? And so that's the second theme of the book, which Dan had really left that out in the first version of this. So we started an introduction to the book, and then Dan wrote 20 pages, I wrote 70 pages. And we then negotiated over a year with the Chinese co-authors of what to do and how to do that. So I want to give you a little bit of that combination of creative themes coming together. How can we present this for the summit? The summit is the meeting on December 21st of this month that will be in English and Chinese. And a year ago, we had 1.4 million participants online through Zoom and related connecting procedures. And these follow up on more regular meetings during the year, but this is a public meeting once a year, which is why we're talking about this right now. So what we will do is to say a little bit. Each of the four of us will say something about this new book, which is also being launched here. But let me follow up on what's new in the scenes in the last year or two, and many important points illustrated about what Dan has done. And what I suggested adding a series of what we presented in the Scenescapes book as boxes. There are about 100 boxes of 10 lines or maybe a page, a little bit more, that these were brief case studies, illustrations. Sometimes they are anecdotes or illustrations which fit the regression line. That is, they fit the normal pattern, as Dan talked about, for instance, in some of the curves. He showed some of those big cities in China and the smaller cities and how that dropping off by city size was different in China than from other countries. So a quick picture like that tells a story. And what I've suggested doing, and what I'm mentioning here, just a few of these as examples. What and how is different between the old Chicago school of the 1920s, where sociology in general and urban sociology, urban social science were really created in Chicago, in political science, with Gosnell's book was on machine politics. And then the 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 fields of geography and planning, other related ancillary fields have similarly been related to some of these core ideas. That is the dominant view for many of these Chicago theorizing activities was Darwin, natural biology, and used concepts of evolution in competition in the way that Darwin had talked about this for tigers and lions in Africa. Chicago neighborhoods were often then described in PhD theses, student papers, about how the neighborhood I live in was then termed in the politically incorrect label, the Black Belt. That's where I live. It's now called Bronzeville. Okay. So uh, different, so we had both the so-called community areas, Hyde Park, the Black Belt, Bronzeville, the Loop, Lincoln Park. These neighborhoods, if you will, there may be 80 or so of these. These were officially defined by the Chicago sociology faculty and students, grad students, and others in their work. And these were used officially by the census, and specifically the city of Chicago, in the ways that they would label, especially the police. So the police neighborhoods followed and would report crime rates. And this is one example I like to use because I live in, many people say, "Oh, you're from the Black Belt. Are you from Bronzeville? How can you survive there?" And one thing was that the police department, as the data became more close to what we see with other big data becoming available, in the 1920s and 30s, they had one number for Bronzeville, and it was very high. We had lots of people were murdered here. The around the 2000 year, 1990, 2000, the police department got data, made it possible to present, and they published data by points or very small areas. And in that way, one could see with a map where were the crimes in my neighborhood of Bronzeville. And then the powerful result, not just of my neighborhood within here, but also the whole city of Chicago, you could then see what were the patterns that you could see visibly with these points, not the 70 or so community areas. Lincoln Park, Hyde Park, Bronzeville changed. They were not the causes which these were often invoked in those earlier years. Instead, the clear results were the so-called the elevated railroad, the trains, and their stops where people could get on and off of these railroad trains were very, very high risk crime areas. people got burglarized, their purses were stolen when they were getting on and off of these. And these are featured in much of the news media surrounding the riskiness of taking these railroad trains through some Chicago neighborhoods. The corollary, if you will, the contrasting corollary of that is where I live, about 3 miles or so away from that L, the crime rate I live near Martin Luther King Drive, is roughly the same as Lincoln Park and the near north side of the most affluent neighborhoods in Chicago. That is, this refutes the simple idea that low income generates crime, that poor people steal money from the rich people. Not at all. Most of the crimes are related to much more individualized and people getting where that is where the trains are. And if you take those trains and get off, especially at times or places, it's dangerous. But the different neighborhoods which may have things like guards, fences, gates, that is the terms which are used in China, in Brazil, which they had 500 years ago in Spain and Italy, they had big walls. And so the affluent, attractive interiors of those cities like Florence and Rome were hidden from the people in the streets. So there's just, I don't want to go too far on this, but a book of exploring this in detail found that the crime rates around 1500 were such that, and from novels and other sources, a proper lady in Rome or Madrid would never go out alone you'd have to have a guard during in midday. Whereas at nighttime in the Netherlands, in The Hague, in small towns in the Netherlands, Holland, women walked alone at night 500, 600 years ago. So there were very big differences that were not simply density and were not simply related to some of those factors that were widely used in the variables initially posited and stressed by Darwin and by the sociologists and others following Darwin. It was called social Darwinism. And so this in turn led through the 1930s. I'll mention some of the look at my advice here. Animal concepts from Darwin like domination, succession, invasion, we bring in turn into the new ways of recasting this by using, if you will, as a foundational base, the 15 dimensions of scenes. Where do the 15 dimensions come from? Dan and I did not invent any of these. These come from world history, social theory, philosophy, and they include things that he mentioned: self-expression, localism, neighborliness. You know this from the Scenescapes book, in which he had shown in the tables there. These foundational concepts, in turn, come from the raw data, which I've showed briefly, where we have things like the numbers of McDonald's restaurants, the numbers of cafes, the numbers of cafeterias, the numbers of Baptist churches, Roman Catholic churches, and so forth. So these raw data can be generating middle level concepts like localism. And these in turn can be used as foundational elements of the study of, and that's a big addition, which is in this new book. This is not just cities. We are doing this to interpret the world. Maybe not at all by imposing the concept that the world is the same. We want to be able to show that the world is different by not only the world, but my black belt where I live in my one neighborhood. We want to go beyond the label that it's a dangerous neighborhood. That's wrong. My neighborhood is safe on my block, 2 blocks, 5 blocks, 8 blocks, north and south. If I go 20 blocks to where over to the L tracks, it's a dangerous neighborhood. But the term neighborhood is not appropriate here. The question is what can we use instead? And what we're trying to incorporate is what's in people's minds, what subjectively they want or they feel or how they define as Hyde Park, and is Hyde Park a dangerous neighborhood? And many people are telling you that Hyde Park is dangerous, but there are multiple sub neighborhoods within. Okay, so that's I'm giving you some quick overviews of bigger points. I'll just mention in passing that the we add some boxes to make the general points that the end of the 19th century was a transformation via the rise in many fields of relativism. In physics, Einstein; in philosophy, the pragmatists of Dewey and Peirce; in Max Weber, the rise of multi-causality; in anthropology, the concept of cultural relativism; in statistics and mathematics, the idea that many relationships are probabilistic, not deterministic, not Newtonian math or physics, but Einsteinian relativized. These came together in many different fields of life, and then it exploded with World War I. After World War I, we had the complications of the disasters of so many of the intellectual leadership, universities, countries, cities were destroyed, and the emerging leadership in the world were the US and Russia. And the Europeans were no longer in a leadership position worldwide in ways that we had the efforts to transform and to understand where these different orientations could be adapted. So we have things in progress. We have boxes about these bigger transformational perspectives. So, for instance, we have scenes and Marxism, scenes and Max Weber, scenes and relativism, in ways that these explicitly articulate more than we did in the Scenescapes book. These concepts can be connected more explicitly, and this is now we're more conscious of these because scenes research and activities are more systematic and explicitly international. And this is the internationalism has risen with cell phones, with the internet, with travel, with students. I've consciously, as you can see here now, I've tried for the last about 30, 40 years to have Chinese teaching assistants. And I have then asked them, and that's why you see part of us we do now, he's being cautious because in part of his English is more hesitant, but he's very smart and writes very, very well in excellent English. So but my simple point is we need the Chinese to ask what is uniquely Western and how the Chinese say, is this different in China? And you saw that with Dan trying to say where and why is China similar and how and why is Beijing different from Shanghai? These are the kinds of questions, methods, and data which we are now able to answer with more precision the than we could have done in the past. All right, let me stop there. We are 5:49. Actually, no, we are that's all. So any follow-up questions from the two of you which you want to add present here now? Gavin or Yuhan?
Yeah, I think I'm all good. I don't think I have any more questions.
Good. Okay.
Yeah, I also do not have any question, but I'm very interested about like people in Chicago very concerned about like related with the safety or crime issues because from my previous work, we also like focus on just one step of infrastructure, like transportation. So people, but we don't consider about like in different geographical scale, like for different city, but we measurement like people's perception from different online platform. Like we have like three different like social media, not social media, like customer management, relationship management system. So we can collect some people's like review or people's like perception for this infrastructure. In Chicago, most of people like even they from different the review from different platform resources, but most of them are concerned about safety issue. So I think that's very interesting for the specific scheme, I think.
Okay, now that I'm glad you're explicitly raising that. And the dramatic scene which we almost would have presented Monday, but we have instead, and I'll mention here, Hyesun Jeong, Heysun, last name Jeong. She did a PhD here and has taught at the University of Texas and has carried on. She has a website. She's active in our scenes research. And one thing which she pursued in her PhD was risk and danger in subways and public transit like that. And she had lived in Seoul. She grew up in Korea. She then she studied, she got a BMA, PhD in the US. Then she worked in France, in Paris. So she knew the three countries and she used the three cities, Seoul, Paris, and Chicago. And she used national data for all of the 30,000 communes in France, 45,000 zip codes for the US, and the local areas within Seoul. So she did qualitative case studies of going around on her bicycle, taking photographs of menus. And then she'd take a picture of the menu, and I did this first, but she followed up and took the same things, and we would contrast separately the Cubs and the White Sox stadiums are baseball centers, and their surrounding areas are drastically different. Around IIT, it is very dangerous and low, considered dangerous, high crime rates from the normal data. and very few restaurants or bars and so forth or social life nearby. By contrast, on the north side, the Cubs neighborhood is filled with dozens and dozens of bars and restaurants and related drinking, carousing people before, during, but especially after those baseball games. And so what's interesting is about only a few, less than 1 mile away is also the major gay orientation neighborhood on the street of Broadway now. It's sometimes changed a little bit to others, but basically, if you take the photographs of the menus next to the Cubs restaurants, you have hamburgers, hot dogs, beer, French fries, and which you can also get, in diners across America. You walk a little bit the other way to the gay neighborhood, and they have very exotic, herbal, vegan restaurants. They have all kinds of subtle sorts of food. They have clothes which they sell for dressing in very unusual ways. That is, you can see at counting the number of vegan restaurants or looking at the menus, even if it's just called restaurant, you can find big cultural differences by combining these different sorts of data. So Jeong basically has taken the concept of bohemianism from our question we dealt with at the beginning today. Where did the flaneur and Benjamin and the 19th century in Italy and Paris come to Seoul, Chicago, and Paris? And she contrasts these, and she shows specifically how can we make subway life safer. Her answer is Chicago is the worst in the world. Or let's say American subways are generally, New York is the same, whatever, New York, Chicago. The partial exceptions are Washington, D.C. and San Francisco are somewhat safer and more more widely used. By contrast, Paris is okay. They have much more widely used subways in Paris, and they're not. It's not simply police that may make a difference, but that's trivial. The third and most important to illustrate her point is Seoul, Korea. They have hugely built. They have, it's 4 times bigger than Paris or New York. It's a huge city spread out, and they have lots and lots of subways and trains, and they're very safe. They have at the stops where you get off, whereas in Chicago you can get shot. In Seoul, they have restaurants, they have shopping malls, they have concerts which they have scheduled in advance, and they have these leading bands, the so-called Korean wave of dancing, singing, music that are spreading around, especially Asia, but also the rest of the world. This Korean music of new performances are continually performing nearby the subway entrances. And the crowds come there, and it's safe. I'll end it there. She has a paper published on this in the Journal of Urban Affairs, and a version of this is on her website, Hyesun Jeong, and there's a little bit is on her syllabus of the course of urban policy. We'll end it there. We have you can email to the two of us if you have questions about problems on the exam. Anything you want to mention, Yuhan, about the exam, or shall we just end it here?
Yeah, I think for exam we just follow the previous like structure. We have like six or three term to explanation, and also we have three option for like for the short essays. So it's more cover like uh, it will cover all material we already mentioned in class. So I'm currently still like prepare this the steps. I will send it later for this week.
Okay. Thank you much. And
Mhm.
we will end there for today.
Mhm.